Hi, Shreya. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss your work. We're excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, before we get into your paper is titled An Evaluation Framework for Clinical Use of Large Language Models in Patient Interaction Tasks. Tell us a little bit about your journey into machine learning and then into this space specifically.
I think it began sometime in my undergrad. I really liked coding when I started my undergrad, and I was a biotechnology major. So, by default, I started exploring some healthcare AI projects, took a bunch of classes, and then I think I really liked doing that. And so, after graduating, I worked at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute for a while to explore more of the cancer space because that was something that I got interested in during my undergrad. And then once I started my PhD, I sort of tried to combine the healthcare side and the machine learning side together.
Now, and what's the motivation for this work specifically?
Yeah, I think this all started in a conversation with one of the co senior authors of the paper. We were just discussing, at that time, GPT-4 had just come out. Everyone was very excited about the new technology, and like it was really good compared to the GPT-3 models. And so we were just talking to one of the clinicians about what they thought of like GPT-4 surpassing the medical board exam, like cutoffs and everything. And that's when we actually came to know that there was some limitations in how people were kind of evaluating these LLMs. And so I think that was like the very spark of the project. But all happened with discussions with like so many doctors and just casual discussions, not even something that we thought would lead to a project.
Can you talk about the relationship between, because you open the paper talking about the importance of doctors being able to compile accurate patient histories. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that with accurate diagnoses and the opportunity you think it presents for innovative solutions like LLM models in this space?
Absolutely. So I think initially when people were evaluating LLMs, they were evaluating them on medical board exams, which basically have a paragraph of a symptoms or a case vignette and a couple of answer choices sometimes. Now, that basically assumes that you always have all of the information related to the patient present at the very beginning, and then you just have to diagnose from that. But oftentimes one of the challenges in clinical settings, and something that residents are often trained to, like a skill to acquire, is how do you ask the right questions to collect each and every
Right.
key piece of information so that you can then make the diagnosis. So I think LLMs fit very well into this space just because by by the nature of LLMs, they are conversational agents. They are not specifically tuned to respond only in a certain way. They can respond to very different kinds of queries. And so we thought that it would be very interesting if we can see how LLMs perform when we ask LLMs not just to diagnose, but to first collect the information from the patients, asking the right questions, and then based on that conversation, diagnose the patient.
Okay. And I'm just going to read from your paper a little bit. You write, these AI models, you're referring specifically to LLMs, have the ability to engage in nuanced conversations, like you just said, making them ideal candidates for extracting comprehensive patient histories and assisting physicians in generating diagnoses. In an ideal world, how do you, and we're not there yet, and which your paper shows, but in an ideal world, how do you see LLM models being used in this field?
That's a great question, actually. I think there are many possibilities, but one that we think would be the most the near future is, as you already know, that the wait times to see a specialist sometimes can be really long. And some conditions, like maybe malignancy, could require a more urgent consultation. So, what we see these agents as a way of collecting the patient history to then triage the patients. And so, if someone, for example, could just sitting at their home, chat with an LLM, and the LLM could have a potential diagnosis that, oh, this patient might have a cancer situation or maybe a very severe infection. They could triage the patient to be seen by an emergency care specialist or a specialty physician so that they can get the care at the time when they have the problem, and they don't have to wait a couple of weeks or months to get to that appointment. And I think it would also not just help in triaging. One of the things that actually one of the co-authors of the paper brought up was that she's a dermatologist and she sees patients. She gets 15 minutes to talk to the patients, and she just said that a lot of the time, out of those 15 minutes, I'm spending asking the questions that an LLM could just have asked and created a summary for me, and I could have just started off from that point. So the time
Right.
that is spent with the patient could have been used much more efficiently. So I think in a similar way, creating summaries from patients' description of the symptoms and all the medications, for example, that they're taking, so that the doctor, when they see the patient, has like a neat summary in front of them and they can like quickly read it in 5 seconds and then begin like conversation. And I also know there is a company in Boston. They actually reached out to us after the paper got published because they are trying to do very similar things in their company. So it's a company which has an online consultation service to patients, and all of them are board certified physicians. And so patients can all, like talk about, oh, I had this stomach ache, and I have this nausea feeling, what do I do? Even basic queries like that, to something like, I'm bleeding and the bleeding is not stopping, what should I do? And these physicians then respond to them on text, and they are able to offer them medical advice for the time being, and then also recommend if they should go and visit someone in person. So the companies, when we talked to them, they said that, oh, if the LLMs could actually draft a response for us and we could quickly edit it, the speed at which we would be able to respond to these patients would increase by so much that it would be, and it's all safe because with before sending out the response, a board certified physician is actually looking at the response. And so I think there is so many opportunities in the space, especially because conversation is a very natural way in which people interact with each other. And so if you have an AI agent acting as a conversational agent in the medical setup, these are just like three examples that come to mind, but I'm sure there are many that people are exploring.
So I'm interested in, and you touched on it a little bit here, the four component framework that you present. So there's the clinical LLMs, a patient AI agent that interacts with the LLM, a grader agent that kind of assesses the correctness of the diagnosis, and then sort of the feedback mechanism with the medical experts. Can you talk to us a little bit about the purpose of each component, what each component is doing?
Yeah. So the clinical LLM is the model that we want to evaluate. So it could be like the O1 model, it could be GPT-4 model, it could be any model basically. It doesn't have to necessarily be open source or commercial. The framework allows for both models to be assessed. The patient AI agent is basically acting as the pseudo patient. The medical exam questions have a paragraph of symptoms. So that's basically the patient's medical condition. So we provide that to the patient AI agent and ask the patient AI agent to respond based on that case variant, but respond only to the questions that are being asked, and respond sort of in layman language, not using medical terminologies. That's usually present when you see the question. The clinical LLM is asking questions, the patient AI agent is responding back, and once this back and forth conversation concludes, the clinical LLM then makes a diagnosis. So the diagnosis is then assessed by the grader AI agent. And in sort of this whole setup, we wanted something that's self reliant. So they can keep conversing with each other. The great AI agent can then quickly come and check if the diagnosis was matching the correct answer. So, correct for medical synonyms, for example, make sure that if there is a disease subtype or there's not a disease subtype, it's taking into account when telling whether it's the right diagnosis or not. So, things like that. But in this self-reliant system, we obviously want to have some error estimates. So that's where the human experts come in, and you only need that feedback mechanism once you're setting up the system. So they evaluate whether the patient AI agent and grader AI agent are actually reliable. So you want the patient AI agent to only be responding in layman language. You want the grader AI agent to be accurately assessing equivalence of diagnosis. So I think that's the overall setup. And one really nice thing that comes out of this is something that would have taken a human experiment many, many days or weeks to do if a human was playing the role of a patient and was interacting with LLMs. So not only was it ethically problematic, because LLMs could have some biases, and if humans are interacting a lot with them, they could be affected negatively by these biases. But it would also take a lot of time. So people would not be able to do that at scale, especially given that you have so many LLMs. Every new week, there's a new LLM.
Right.
And so I think one of the importance in this four component framework is that once you've validated with the human experts that the patient AI agent and the creator AI agent are doing fine, and you can also do some quality assessment of clinical LLM, like just some conversations, then this is pretty much a self reliant system. So you can run this on different models and you can benchmark them according to this model is good at this, but maybe at asking questions, but maybe not at getting to the right diagnosis, something like that.
When you say clinical LLMs, this can be any LLM that is used in the clinical field, or is there something that makes the LLM a clinical LLM?
Yeah, it can be both. We were focusing on general purpose LLMs, which are not specifically clinical, but we called it clinical LLM because we wanted to specifically just look at the clinical aspect of the LLM. But there are some language models that people have trained. There is Clinical BERT, I know, which is a really good model trained only on clinical information. And there are newer models. I think there was a paper that was published probably like 2 days after our study got out, which was building a clinical conversational agent. And so I think definitely you can have both of these.
It would be interesting to see if those perform better, right? Then one would think that they would. Or what are your
Yeah, I
thoughts?
think no, that's a great point. I think with clinical LLMs, right, up till very recently, they were much smaller models, and so they had a lower capacity to learn. The bigger the model, the more the model can learn, and the better the model gets. Now, these open AI models, for example, O1, they are really big. They have millions and they have trillions of parameters actually. Overall, in terms of general capabilities, they are much better than the specialized models that were trained for specific clinical tasks. But I think as the model sizes scale and as we get better training methodologies, I do think that having more clinically focused LLM would be like great, and it could in the future surpass the general purpose LLMs.
Okay, that's interesting. So going back to the four components, my understanding is that you're evaluating each component differently. What are you specifically looking for at each stage?
Yeah, so I think the main idea is that for like the clinical LLM, we want to know whether it's asking the right questions. We want to know whether it's able to diagnose from scattered information. So all the information is not presented in one go. This is important actually because oftentimes in training, you only are doing one single turn conversation. Information was provided and the LM answered, and you just graded that. But oftentimes people don't really check whether if you have a scattered information flow, how does that happen? For the patient, yeah, for the patient, we were looking primarily at making sure that the patient was not hallucinating, so only answering based on the case vignette, and the patient AI agent was also not using medical terminology. For the grade AI agent, we wanted to make sure that it's concordant with how a doctor would grade the diagnosis as being the same or not. And so we found that in 100% of the cases, the patient AI agent was not really hallucinating. But in some of the cases, it was using some slight medical terminology. So that's like, I think 3% of our evaluated conversations, so a low rate. Even for the grade AI agent, we found that in about 95% of the scenarios, it did match with what a board certified doctor would have said. And so I think overall, like we were focusing on for the patient and the grade AI agent, just the reliability, and the clinical LLM on metrics that would give more insight into the behavior.
Okay. Now, for the evaluation method for Craft MD, that's what you call the framework. Tell us a little bit about how you conducted that. The 2,000 case vignettes. 1,800 of which were curated from MedQA. Elaborate on that process a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, there were 2,000 different medical cases which we evaluated. So, these medical cases spanned 12 different medical specialties because we wanted to be a little bit generic in seeing across different specialties, not just specific to one. And of these 200 case vignettes, 1,800 were sourced from MedQA, which contains USMLE questions, which is the US board exam. 100 of them were sourced from a dermatology question bank, which is public, and so anyone can also access that. And then, because we wanted to have some part of the data, which was we were sure that that would not have been part of the model's training, we actually created 100 new case vignettes. And these were also dermatology focused. So overall, 1,800, 100, and 100 formed the 2,000 case vignettes. I think one interesting thing that sort of is related to these case vignettes is because we were worried about how much of the USMLE dataset or the dermatology question bank that we had would have been part of the training set. And
Right.
so we did, and I think this is still a very active area of research. How do you know whether a piece of text was part of the training? So we did something called meld analysis. Meld analysis is basically you have a piece of text, you cut it into half, and you ask the model to complete the rest of the text. So you provided the first half and ask it to complete the rest of the text. So the completion text and the original text that you had, you then calculate something called the Levestein distance, which will basically is a sort of a similarity metric to compare two different pieces of text. And so the people who actually came up with this method proposed cutoffs that if the similarity is greater than this, then they were part of the training data set. But if
Mm.
not, then it's a then it's not like a conclusion that it was not part of the training data set. You still don't know, but it's like sort of a test that will tell you if it definitely was a part of the training data set. So we
Right.
tried to see if the MedQA data set and the public dermatology question bank was in the similar range in terms of the similarity metric as our private data set, and it was quite similar. So it was at least a little bit of a relief that it's definitely not very clearly biasing when it's responding to the different questions.
Wow. So now talking about the results, you mentioned already to some of them, but how did CraftMD perform compared to typical evaluation methods?
Absolutely. So in our framework, we did have these four components, but because we wanted to assess the clinical LLM's capability to ask questions and get to the diagnosis and so on, we had different experimental setups. One of the experimental setups was vignettes, which is basically you provide the LLM with the exam style like paragraph of symptoms and you ask the LLM to give the diagnosis. So this was exactly how people in other benchmark or evaluation methods did the evaluation. And we found that the broader accuracy numbers that we had on our dataset was similar to how other people had evaluated and found in their own studies. But the unique aspects about the framework was the multi-turn conversations, the single-turn conversations, and something that we call summarized conversations. So these metrics were not present in the other data sets. And multi-turn conversation, as the name suggests, is basically a back and forth between the clinical LLM and the patient AI agent. The single-turn setup was when we restricted the clinical LLM to diagnose without asking questions. So if you sort of compare multi-turn and single-turn, you can see that it's the exact same setup, but in one case you could ask follow-up questions, in one case you couldn't. And so if you compare the single-turn and multi-turn, you could in a way quantify what was the benefit of the follow-up questions that were being asked and were these actually
Right.
useful to getting to a better diagnosis. And then finally, we had summarized conversation, which also was unique to our setup. So, because we were evaluating scattered information, we also wanted to see if the scattering itself of the information was leading the LLMs to respond incorrectly, because most of the training of these LLMs is not really done in a very multi turn fashion. So, we took all the multi turn conversation responses of the patient, consolidated it into a paragraph similar to how a medical exam case vignette would look like. The only difference was the information which was asked by the clinical LLM was present in this. And so it could have less amount of information than what should have been there. So in the summarized conversation, we took that information and we asked the LLM to diagnose from that paragraph. So not only could it potentially miss information, but it was also in layman language. So we could kind of assess both of them, that what would happen if you remove the medical buzzwords from the text, or what would happen if some of the information was missing, like those kind of things. So I think it was a sort of head-on comparison for the vignette setup, but in comparison to the other settings that we had, we introduced the evaluation technique.
Okay. Now, and I want to dive deeper into some of those points, but you pull out how the conversational interactions reduced the diagnostic accuracy. I guess you kind of said maybe this is because of the way that the training data is set up. To me, it was a little bit interesting that this was across all LLMs, or was that not surprising to you, or what were your thoughts when you found that out?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. I think we were all pretty surprised when we saw. So I think I expected that compared to vignettes, conversations would have a reduced accuracy, because I expected that the LLMs would miss asking important information, and so if the information is absent, you probably cannot get to the right diagnosis. So I think for that, I wasn't very shocked, but I was really surprised that comparing multi-turn conversations and summarized conversations, which contain the exact same information, only a different format, that actually led to a decrease in accuracy. And it was surprise. And then also the multi-turn conversations had a lower accuracy, the summarized conversation had a higher accuracy, and the summarized conversation also had a lower accuracy compared to the vignettes. So you have vignettes which have all the information and the medical terminology, which makes the diagnosis easy. Then you have summarized conversations, which lack some information most of the times, and they also don't have medical terminology, they are all layman. Then you have multi-turn conversations, which are exactly how back and forth a patient would probably communicate with the doctor. So I think I was really surprised that the there was a difference between multi-turn and summarized conversation, um,
Yeah.
because you would have expected it's the same information. And LLMs are, we assume that I don't have to provide all the information at once when I'm typing into the LLM. I would probably provide with some information, just like we chat probably with friends. I don't know. I chat with a lot of back and forths. So I was really surprised with that. That's such a good question.
If the single turn and the multi-turn conversation, the performance is different between those two. And like you said, most likely in the real world situation, it would be a multi-turn conversation because the whole point is to ask questions and to gather the patient history. What are the implications of that for seeing something like this deployed in real world situations? Like, what would you want people to kind of keep in mind then as they're building or using
Yeah.
this?
Yeah, I think given that the current state of the model is there is a difference in accuracy for multi-turn conversations compared to the paragraph summaries, like summarized conversation. If I was a fellow developer and someone was asking me for a opinion, I would just say that if you want more accuracy on something you're doing, you should just take the conversation and at the back end convert it into a summarized conversation and then do the processing with the LLM, because I think it would likely lead to a better situation. But I think it opens up a lot of possibilities in the future to actually improve upon this, because sometimes you kind of want the responses to be very immediate, and
Yeah.
maybe the time taken to actually convert all of this, though it's very fast, but I think it depends on like the exact application. But I think definitely some very interesting research questions, how to improve multi-turn accuracy.
Yeah. You include a table of proposed recommendations for the evaluation of clinical LLMs. Can you share some of the ones that we haven't addressed yet and why you think they're important?
There's one thing that we actually did in the paper that was very mind blowing to me. So we had this one figure in which we showed that two different versions of the same model. So Mistral is the open source model, Mistral version 1 and Mistral version 2. We compared those two to see how they performed in these vignettes, multi-turn conversation, single-turn conversation, summarized conversation. And so, because usually people are optimizing for the vignettes, they are trying to optimize that metric, and we saw that yes, definitely there was an improvement in the vignettes in going from version 1 to version 2, but the conversational accuracies actually went down, which was very
Really?
surprising. It was basically like, which is I think one of the recommendations in recommendation number 6, I think, which basically was saying that continuous evaluation of conversational abilities is actually important, and the setting the right target for the application that you're trying to do is supremely important. Especially with these LLMs, I think they're supposed to be more of a chat based system. The developers are probably expecting that people will be having multi tone conversations. So I think having the right
Right.
evaluation benchmark is so important to make sure that in the next versions that you have, you are actually making progress upwards and in the most important, like metric, not just a proxy metric, which is I think something that was very interesting. And one other thing that I can mention, which I think we sort of touched on in the paper, we looked at what happens if you provide these LLMs with a medical image, because sometimes,
Oh,
especially in
yeah.
the, like dermatology, the doctors actually need to see, they can't really always tell without seeing. So we were very curious to see what would happen, and like these images are supposed to definitely increase the confidence in diagnosis, lead to more accurate diagnosis, but we didn't really see that. So which was another,
Really?
yeah, like the difference between when you provide them with just the text versus when you provide them with the text and the image, there was no difference, like any statistically significant difference between the two situations for all the setups for vignettes, multi-tone conversation, single-tone conversation, summarize. So for each of these setups, we did two sort of like modifications, one with the image, one without the image, and there was no difference. So I think it was surprising to me, at least. I would have expected that there would have been. So I think another very interesting research direction for me personally is how do you improve these multimodal LLMs so that they can process different kinds of
Yeah.
information in efficient ways.
Do you have a hypothesis for why? Do you think it's just processing the two different modalities at the same time? Or do you have another hypothesis for why the images didn't help?
Yeah, there can be two reasons. One is the learning capacity of the model. So, the capacity of the model is determined by the size of the model. So, the vision component of the model, which processes these images, is much smaller than the language component. So, the capacity is limited on that front. Another is alignment between these two modalities. So, image by itself, like computer vision space, is very advanced. They are able to do segmentation, classification really well. On the language side, again, you have so much advancement because people are able to do so many things with these language models. But the AI models are, you have to align both these modalities together so that the model can know that this image and this text is related in some way. So I think that alignment could also be one of the factors. I think there's a lot of research going on how to improve that alignment between different modalities. And I think in the future, once you start adding like speech and all these other modalities too, this would be a consistently target that people will be chasing after to improve, all of these. Yeah.
So I guess we could consider that a limitation, but are there other limitations of this work as it stands now?
I think when we like evaluated these LLMs, we had one patient AI agent, but one question that arises is how realistic is the patient AI agent compared to real patients? Because
Mhm.
I think everyone has a different way in responding to a doctor. Some patients might be sharing a lot of information. Some patients might be not, like, they may not even realize, or they may forget about some things. There are so many of these things which realistically happen, but we didn't really simulate this in our setup. So I think definitely the future work builds on top of comparing how realistic the patient AI agent is to the real world patients, and to make that difference smaller and smaller. That would be really, I think, very very nice. And I think also we evaluated on a lot of different specialties, but all of these had one major diagnosis. A lot of the times in real world scenarios, patients can have multiple problems. They can have blood pressure and they can have some kidney issues. But right now, we couldn't evaluate as such what would happen if there were multiple issues. Will the LLM get one of the issues correct? Will the LLM
Mm.
do something like wrong in that? So I think that's definitely something that um, like more public data sets or more data sets which have these complex medical scenarios, if they were available, researchers could actually also test that. So I think definitely there's very, very interesting directions for future work.
Yeah. So who would you like to see read this paper?
I think anyone who is thinking about a career in medicine should definitely read this work, like doctors, because I think now, because these models are becoming so ubiquitous, a lot of the times doctors are also sort of interested in seeing how these models can enhance their learning about medicine. So I've heard like some of my friends actually playing doctor with ChatGPT. So they'll ask the ChatGPT to behave as a patient, and they'll try to diagnose. It's very important to think about all of these when you're trying to use these LLMs. So I definitely think people who are interested in pursuing something in medicine would be interested in this work. But also, I think all the companies who are focused on providing online consultation to
Yeah.
patients, for example, they could actually benefit also from deploying methods like this for triaging of patients, for example, so that they can respond to urgent queries more quickly as soon as possible, kind of thing.
Yeah. I had just had a conversation with Venitra Swami about her work Interpret CC, which is all about interpretability and explainability. One of her experiments was breast cancer research in the medical field. I don't think you really touch on it much in this paper, but the interpretability and explainability aspect of clinical LLMs, if they're reaching diagnoses, how are they doing it? What kind of insight should we be able to have into these models and how they're coming up with their diagnoses?
That's a great question. I think interpretability in a LLM has become pretty different than the conventional notion of interpretability in like an image based model, for example. In image based model, people try to have like a heat map of, oh, this is the location of the image that the model is looking at, and so if this is actually the correct location, for example, if it's a chest x-ray and they're trying to find pneumonia, and they try to create a heat map of the model's gradients, and they try to see which part of the image was the model looking at, then you can kind of tell whether the model is broadly making the diagnosis in the way that it should, and it's not using shortcuts. But I think in the language model space, these models are so big that it's not the same direct comparison. What I have seen people do is, for example, the DeepSeek models that just came out a couple of weeks ago, they actually show you the think chain. So as the model reasons through to get to the next response, you can actually see its internal reasoning, and all of that is in plain text. So you can actually read it, and you can check if that reasoning is compatible with how like a human doctor would have done that same reasoning. So I think there are people are coming up with new ways of looking at the interpretability problem in the language model space, and I definitely think that looking at some of these internal chain of thought of these models will be like the way in which people start uh, thinking about interpretability in the space.
That reminds me of the last we spoke, I had asked you, DeepSeek, I think, had come out the week before, and I'd asked you if you'd um, run this with DeepSeek, and you said you were going to, or you had, but the results hadn't been published yet. Have they been published yet? What were your findings?
Yeah, we were all pretty excited about that. So I would say stay tuned. We are about to release.
Okay.
So basically, because these LLMs are progressing like so frequently, we made a live benchmark alongside our paper. In the paper, there are I think 5 models, and now in the benchmark we have 15 models. And so we are continuously adding models to that benchmark. We added O1 when O1 came out. We are about to add DeepSeek as well.
That's exciting. So, future work, we mentioned there are a couple interesting avenues for future work related to this paper. What about for yourself? You have the DeepSeek results coming out that we're going to stay tuned for. What other exciting things do you have coming up or research papers coming out?
Yeah, so I think we were talking about this a little bit, that how do you improve multi-turn conversational capabilities? And so I'm personally exploring some of the reinforcement learning methods. I'm basically trying to use some of the RL methods to improve upon these multi-turn conversations. So basically the focus of that research is to make sure that the LLMs are good at asking questions. And so I'm very excited. We are very early stages of the project, but hopefully we'll be able to improve the question asking capabilities.
And we'll have to stay tuned for that as well. Thank you, Shreya, so much for joining us and talking to us about your work. It's really exciting stuff.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed discussing all of this with you.